Thank you, Patrika. Delighted to be joining the event. Hope the next one that I join is in person and I get to meet all of you. Um, Today, I'll be talking about how crisis accelerates technological change, but not the kind of technological change that we're used to thinking about being accelerated by crisis. And then I'll draw out some implications for what we have been through collectively over the last year or so means for the future of artificial intelligence and automation in retail. We've known for a long time that when faced with crisis, societies innovate more aggressively. During World War II, a wide variety of technological innovation was catalyzed, ranging from the creation of nuclear power all the way up to the invention of the modern computer, the emergence of modern cryptography. There was a whole host of really aggressive innovation in the aerospace sector. Now, if you think about it, though, all of this innovation was targeted at ending the crisis, at trying to end the war, trying to get victory to whichever country was innovating. But behind the scenes, there was a whole host of other acceleration of change that was taking place based on the responses that societies had sort of gone through in order to address the crisis. So, for example, as many male members of the workforce went off to war, this dramatically accelerated the participation of women in the workforce. This had been ongoing for a while, but the crisis accelerated this ongoing change. Similarly, when returning veterans who came back to their countries, especially in the United States, left the cities and sought out a more peaceful existence in the suburbs. Now, again, this movement from the city to the suburbs was a gradual change leading up to the war, but was accelerated dramatically in its aftermath. So if we fast forward to today, we see that there is a tremendous amount of innovation that is taking place to end the current COVID crisis that we are facing. And we've seen results of this innovation over the last year in the form of the use of AI and the use of mRNA technology to create in record time, a vaccine that we hope will sort of end the lockdowns and slow the spread this coming year. But again, these are technological breakthroughs that are aimed at ending the crisis. And much like the technological breakthroughs that led to the digital revolution that we're all participating in, the AI revolution, the emergence of the semiconductor TCP/IP, which led to the creation of the internet, and in the future, I'm sure, quantum computing. I'm not saying that these technological breakthroughs don't matter. They certainly do, and they are at the center of technological change. But the real thrust of my talk today is that there are other changes, there are other forces surrounding these technological breakthroughs that play a big role in determining the pace of technological change. So if we sort of move away now from crisis response and to think about the technological changes that are central to the artificial intelligence and automation and platform revolution that we're going through, certainly the foundations have been laid by digital progress, by scientific breakthrough. But a technology does not really take off and cause change unless other forces are aligned. Institutional forces like labor viscosity, political factors, credit availability can slow the spread of automation. Techonomic forces, network effects, economies of scope, the coming of age or the coming of critical mass of collective intelligence, AI systems, each of these needs to be in place before a technology actually starts to have the impact that it's technologically capable of having. And perhaps most importantly, there are behavioral changes that need to take place in order for people to embrace a technology after something is technologically feasible, An easy example here is of broadsheet newspapers, which continue to be read for a couple of decades after internet-based news became widely available. This had to do less with a technological force than, a behavioral change. So what happens when we bring this framework to bear in thinking about crisis and technological change? Well, it gives us a new lens through which to understand the extent to which the crisis that we're going through is going to accelerate not technological change caused by the creation of new technologies, but the extent to which it's going to accelerate ongoing technological change. And if you think about it, the acceleration of tech change that we are going through today, or of tech-enabled change that we are going through today, is being shaped less by dramatic new progresses in digital technologies, and it is being shaped more by changes to these forces. There are changes to the institutional forces, to labor viscosity. There are changes to the techonomic forces because of massive shifts in demand. There are dramatic changes to our behaviors that have been forced by the lockdowns and the shelter-in-place orders that we've gone through over the last year. And so what collectively these changes in these technology sort of shaping forces, these institutional forces, these techonomic forces, and these behavioral forces, what the changes can do is to cause a crisis to accelerate ongoing change, where you're on the path to change and then suddenly you've leapfrogged to a place that you didn't expect to be for 4 or 5 years. Or for certain technologies that may have fallen into that chasm that we're all familiar with, it may allow them to actually jump over that chasm, reach critical mass, and become mainstream technologies where, absent the crisis, it may have, these technologies may simply have, not succeeded or not reached critical mass. So let me pause for a minute here and tell you what's next. So what I'm going to do now is try and take the framework that I've given you, the techonomic forces, the behavioral forces, and the institutional forces, and apply them to the changes that we are seeing in response to the COVID crisis in retail, and in specifically for the advent of automation and artificial intelligence in retail. So starting first with the acceleration of retail automation, there are a number of changes to these forces that lead us to expect that retail automation will be accelerated by the crisis. The massive labor market shock that we went through in the middle of last year removes barriers to automation. It sort of lowers the labor viscosity that is associated, which can slow down automation even when it's technologically feasible. Another big barrier to successful implementation of an automation strategy is having an executive mindset that is geared towards, going through the process changes that have to accompany the implementation of a new technology. Most successful technology implementations are successful not because they chose the right technology, but because the organization had the foresight and the leadership to be able to invest in complementary organizational change. Now, in order to do that successfully, you need a change-oriented mindset. And over the last 1 year, executives have been thinking almost exclusively about responding to change. And so this mindset dramatically accelerates the rate at which we might successfully implement automation. Historically, the data shows that following a recession, robotics investments are catalyzed and increase faster than expected. And the collective intelligence, the data that these systems rely on in order to be able to actually, do the things, recommend the products, behave in a human-like manner, has been accelerated because the volume of digital data, of transaction data, the sort of the density of data trails that we have been leaving over the last year has increased significantly as a vast majority of our interactions have moved from physical world to being digital. So you put all these forces together, and the anticipation that you have is that automation will be accelerated, right? And the data seems to bear that out. I mean, a survey of executives done globally, 800 executives done globally by McKinsey Global Institute last year, seemed to underscore the fact that a vast majority of executives are seeing not just a significant increase in employee interaction and collaboration. This is something we've all gone through. Not just a change in the digitization of customer channels, which again we're aware of, but a dramatic acceleration in the pace at which they are adopting automation technologies. And my theory is that these forces are what are responsible for this acceleration. Now, what's troubling about this acceleration is the realization that many of us have come to, that the kind of job loss that you see, and especially the automation-driven job loss that you see during a recession, it used to come back in the 20th century. You'd see a bounce back of the kind of routine work that is especially susceptible to automation. But during the last recession, we saw accelerated job losses, and especially of routine jobs rather than the non-routine cognitive or the non-routine manual jobs during the recession. And we did not see the bounce back that we are expecting. And so my sense is that as we see this acceleration of automation of routine jobs in retail and in the consumer industries, much like in the aftermath of the previous recession, we're not going to see these jobs come back. And so that has to do with one side of AI in retail or automation. The narrative of tech replacing humans, which is, the checkout machine replacing the person behind the counter, of humans augmenting technologies, which, has to do with the manager training the call center AI to be able to respond more accurately to customers, or the tech augmenting humans. An example there might be the use of AI to be able to automatically figure out whether a vending machine needs replenishment. And so you've sort of given some superpowers to the individual who otherwise had to manually check it and now can just hold up their phone. And so a vast majority of our mind share when we think about automation in the retail and consumer industries is around tech replacing the humans, or somehow the mix of human and machine changing. But what we don't realize is that a significant fraction of the quote unquote automation in retail is really not because of any of these changes to the mix of human and machine within the confines of an existing business model, but is because of the invention and the subsequent adoption of new business models that alter the need for human labor. And we're 25 years or so into widespread adoption of electronic commerce. And if you think about the electronic commerce business model, it fundamentally changes the things that machines do and the things that humans do. So you need a human to bring you your package rather than picking it up yourself in the store in the e-commerce model. So that's a new sort of labor need for the organization that is providing the e-commerce service. On the other hand, you check out on your own, you pay on your own. And so there are lots of activities that are not automated, as in they are machine. Humans used to do these in the e-commerce model, and now machines are doing them. But fundamentally, the model is designed with a very different mix between what humans need to do and what technology does. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my talk on the acceleration of the adoption of these new business models that fundamentally alter the need for human labor. So about this time last year, I was tracking the growth of e-commerce following, the advent, the introduction of the lockdowns. And my data suggested that we had seen a dramatic increase in e-commerce of up to 100% in the month of April. I had predicted at that time that apparel and accessories e-commerce was going to overtake traditional retail for the fiscal year. And if you look at more recent data, it is clear that around the world, there has been a significant acceleration of e-commerce. And so that is within the confines of the platform retail models that we are used to, the global marketplace model like Amazon, the under the hood model like Shopify. But the model that I think has gained the most traction because of the crisis is the local commerce enabler model. This is platforms that are facilitating a local business becoming an e-commerce vendor. And so your local mom and pop store, your local restaurant, your local specialty retail store, they do not have a sophisticated e-commerce strategy. And Shopify may enable the creation of global e-commerce capabilities among small businesses. But I think what we saw during the crisis was me not being able to go to the store, you not being able to go to your local restaurant, and therefore an acceleration of platform models that bring the local retail to the local customer. And so we certainly saw this in restaurants. I did a study with Uber Eats last summer, which showed a very significant increase in order volumes, in the aftermath of the lockdowns, a dramatic increase in the rate at which small businesses were joining platforms like Uber Eats to survive. It underscored the resilience of the platform business model during crisis. They have different capital requirements. So Hertz had to declare bankruptcy. Uber was able to weather the storm because they don't have capital asset investments in the cars that are taking people around, and because their envelopment capabilities allowed them to branch out a few years ago into food delivery. And so while one went down, the other went up. I think what we're seeing now is an underscoring of the flexibility that platforms have in returning faster following a shock. Airbnb saw just a 17% decline in Q3 of 2020 in its gross booking values compared to Marriott and Hilton, who saw 2/3 declines. You look at the 2020 performance, and Airbnb is way ahead of not just Hilton and Hyatt and Marriott, but also of ahead of the traditional sort of resellers like Expedia and Booking.com. And so, if you think about where this is going, we don't yet have the killer app of retail AI for local commerce. I've always maintained that the app that sort of defines retail AI is the collective intelligence recommender systems, the collaborative filtering systems that started with Amazon and in other sectors, Netflix, but that are using sort of the intelligence that we gather about shopping patterns to create ways in which what is offered to someone is driven not by sort of traditional metrics, but either by customers who are like you bought this stuff, or by the feeding of this data into a deep learning or other AI system. And so this killer app of retail AI has not yet come to local commerce. And a critical determinant of the pace at which AI is adopted in the local commerce context will be the speed with which recommender systems are built by local commerce platforms and the extent to which they give ownership of that recommendation capability to the business that is selling through the platform rather than it being owned by the platform itself. There's also a missing piece of the infrastructure in local commerce, which is the verification of identity. I see some collective identity systems that are going to make it much more seamless for a local business to become a digitally enabled local commerce provider. And there are some really promising startups in this space. I'd be happy to chat with you guys offline if you want to learn more. But let's step back and wrap up at this point, because these early collective intelligence systems, to me, are harbingers of where capitalism is headed. Over the 19th and 20th century, we thought about this dichotomy between approaches to organizing your economy. On the one hand, you had the centrally planned model, and on the other hand, you had the market economy. So the former Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy. The United States was a market economy. What I'm starting to see and what I expect to happen more actively over the next couple of decades is a convergence of these models, the centrally planned model and the market model, towards something that is a hybrid between the two, but where the central planning is done by a collective intelligence, artificial intelligence system, rather than by human beings as it was in the 20th century. And what keeps me up at night these days is that as we are designing the system, we are not doing it consciously. We see this collective intelligence system in action on platforms like Facebook and YouTube, and we all know about the consequences of it. But it seems like we are not consciously designing the world that we want to live in. And if we don't consciously design the world that we want to live in, that is going to be powered by these collective intelligence AIs, whether in the retail sector or elsewhere, someone else will design it for us, and we may not like the world that we end in. So, thank you for your time. I'd be delighted to hear from you following the talk. There are a wide variety of ways to reach me. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you guys in person at some point in a future AI4 conference.